History often credits kings and conquests for the fall of great empires. But what if the true architect of collapse was the land itself? Across continents and centuries, mighty capitals have been left empty, not by invaders, but by the silent, relentless pressure of a changing world. This is a journey to 30 abandoned thrones of power, where the story of their desertion reveals a hidden script written by drought, famine, and ecological exhaustion. By the end, you will see a pattern so consistent it reshapes our understanding of why civilizations rise and fall. We will explore why a city of 1 million people vanished into the jungle and how a desert metropolis ran dry. What do these empty palaces and silent plazas tell us about our own relationship with the planet? The story of Angkor begins with water. At its height, the Khmer capital was a marvel not just of stone temples, but of liquid engineering, a city built to command the monsoon. Its lifeblood was a vast, intricate network of reservoirs, canals, and moats, a system so advanced it transformed the seasonal floods of the sap into a year-round source of power and sustenance. This hydraulic grid allowed the empire to feed a population that some scholars estimate reached 1 million people, supporting the construction of wonders like Angkor Wat. It was a civilization that had seemingly tamed its environment, bending the rhythm of nature to its will. But this intricate balance was fragile, a masterpiece painted on a canvas of climate. Beginning in the 14th century, a new and terrifying pattern emerged. Paleoclimate data, drawn from the study of ancient tree rings in the region, reveals a series of intense, multi-decade. The monsoons, upon which everything depended, began to fail. The great reservoirs known as would have slowly emptied. Canals designed to channel abundance now carried only dust. The agricultural surplus that fueled the empire's grandeur evaporated. This was not a single catastrophic event, but a slow, grinding pressure that lasted for generations. Compounding the crisis, some researchers suggest the very water network that made Angkor great may have been pushed beyond its limits. Maintaining such a vast system required constant, organized labor. As drought strained resources, that maintenance may have lapsed. Canals silted up, and the delicate hydraulic balance was lost. The result was a cascade of failure. Crops withered in the fields. The social contract that bound people to the god-kings in the stone temples began to fray under the strain of hunger and scarcity. Power did not vanish overnight, but it steadily drained away, following the receding waters. The political and spiritual center of the Khmer world gradually shifted south, toward the more reliable waters of the Mekong Delta and the emerging city of Angkor was not conquered, it was relinquished, its stone giants slowly reclaimed by the roots of the encroaching jungle. The silence that fell over its causeway speaks to a profound truth, that even the greatest human achievements are held in a delicate pact with the natural world. When that pact is broken by a changing climate, the foundations of empire can turn to sand. Across the globe, another great city built its power on water, only to be undone by it. In the fertile floodplain of the Mississippi River, where the modern cities of St. Louis and East St. Louis now stand, a different kind of metropolis once thrived. This was Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico. At its peak around the year 1100, it was a city of perhaps 20,000 people, a bustling hub of trade, ceremony, and political power centered around a grand plaza and over 120 earthen mounds. The largest, Monk's Mound, still stands 10 stories tall, a testament to the coordinated labor of a sophisticated society. Cahokia was not just a collection of villages, it was a planned urban center, a capital of the Mississippian culture whose influence stretched across the American heartland. Its life was intimately tied to the Great River, which provided rich soil for agriculture and a highway for commerce. But that same river held a destructive force. Around the year 1200, geological and soil core samples tell a story of catastrophe. Evidence points to a massive flood event, one of the largest in the region's history, that inundated the city's very heart. The central plaza, the residential districts where people lived and worked, were suddenly submerged under feet of water and silt. Imagine the aftermath, not just of damaged homes, but of ruined seasonal crops, contaminated food stores, and a landscape transformed overnight. This was not a gentle rise in water levels, it was a traumatic environmental shock that would have shattered the city's logistical and social foundations. Recovery from such an event would have required immense resilience and unified leadership. Yet, researchers suggest this flood may have been the tipping point for a society already under strain. Centuries of intensive maize agriculture around the city could have depleted local soils. The dense urban population likely placed great pressure on local game and timber resources. The flood, then, did not strike a city at its peak of stability, but one potentially grappling with the slow creep of resource scarcity. The disaster would have amplified every existing tension, challenging the authority of the ruling class who were seen as intermediaries with the spiritual world. If they could not protect the people from the river's wrath, what power did they truly hold? In the decades that followed the Great Flood, Cahokia's influence waned. The coordinated construction on the mound ceased. The flow of trade goods diminished. While people likely continued to live in the area for generations, the city's role as a political and ceremonial capital was effectively abandoned. The Grand Plaza, once the stage for rituals that united a civilization, fell silent, its soil layers preserving the muddy signature of the flood that began its end. Cahokia's story is a powerful reminder that environmental crises are rarely isolated events. They interact with the vulnerabilities a society has already created, turning a challenge into a collapse. A single flood did not erase this metropolis from history, but it exposed the fragile threads holding a complex society together, threads that, once severed, could not be easily retied. The silent stones of Great Zimbabwe hold a different kind of lesson, one of prosperity that sowed the seeds of its own decline. Rising from the plateau of southern Africa, this city of majestic granite walls and conical towers was the heart of a powerful Shona kingdom between the 11th and 15th centuries. Its wealth was legendary, flowing from a vast trade network that sent gold, ivory, and copper to ports on the Indian Ocean, connecting inland Africa to the wider world. This commerce supported a sophisticated urban center, a capital of political and spiritual authority whose stone architecture, built without mortar, symbolized both permanence and power. Yet the very engines of this wealth may have contained a slow-burning fuse. The kingdom's economy rested on two pillars: long-distance trade and, crucially, intensive cattle herding. Cattle were more than livestock. They were a primary form of wealth, social status, and political power. To sustain the large herds required by a growing elite and urban population, vast tracts of land around the city were dedicated to pasture. Over generations, this led to widespread overgrazing. The native grasses were stripped away, and the hooves of countless animals compacted the soil. Compounding this, the demand for timber to build the city and fuel its forges and households led to extensive deforestation of the plateau. The landscape began to change in subtle, then serious, ways. Without tree roots to hold it, the fertile topsoil, once nurtured by the grasslands, became vulnerable to erosion from wind and seasonal rains. The land's capacity to regenerate was simply overwhelmed. Researchers studying soil samples and pollen records in the region suggest a story of gradual ecological exhaustion. The pastures that fed the royal herds grew sparse, the soils less productive. This environmental pressure would have translated directly into social and political strain. A decline in cattle health and numbers threatened the economic foundation of the elite. Harvests from surrounding farmlands, due to degraded soils, could have led to periods of scarcity and hardship for the broader population. The authority of the rulers in their stone enclosures was intimately tied to their ability to ensure prosperity and abundance. When the land could no longer provide, that authority faced a profound crisis. The solution, it seems, was not to repair the damaged landscape, a task that would have required a drastic reduction in herd sizes and a shift in the entire economic model. Instead, the elite appear to have made a calculated decision to move. Sometime in the mid-15th century, the royal court gradually abandoned the stone city, relocating their power base to new territories with untouched pastures and fresher soils to the north and west. Great Zimbabwe was not destroyed, it was simply left behind, a magnificent stone shell emptied of the political life that built it. Its abandonment speaks to a pattern we see again and again, where a society's core formula for success, whether hydraulic engineering or pastoral wealth, becomes unsustainable under its own weight. The city's legacy endures in its stonework, but its empty courtyards whisper a warning about the long-term cost of drawing too heavily, for too long, from the well of the natural world. Deep in the rainforests of Guatemala and Mexico, the stone towers of Tikal and once pierced the canopy as monuments to a rivalry that defined an era. These were not just cities, they were superpowers of the Maya world, locked in a centuries-long struggle for dominance, their histories recorded in stone stelae celebrating victories and alliances. Their grandeur was built upon a foundation of precise astronomical knowledge, intricate trade networks, and a deep understanding of their environment. Yet, by the 10th century, both of these mighty capitals, along with dozens of other lowland city-states, were largely abandoned, their great plazas falling silent. For generations, the question of why this sophisticated civilization fragmented has been one of history's great puzzles, with theories ranging from warfare to social revolt. But modern science has uncovered a culprit that affected both rivals equally, a silent enemy they could not outmaneuver or defeat. Paleoclimatic data, extracted from sediment cores in nearby lakes and cave formations, reveals a terrifying pattern. Beginning in the 9th century and stretching into the 10th, the region was struck by a series of severe multi-decade droughts. These were not simply dry seasons, they were profound shifts in climate that reduced rainfall by a catastrophic amount, perhaps as much as half in some periods. The rainforest, which seems perpetually lush, has a delicate balance. The Maya had developed ingenious methods to thrive there, from terrace farming to collecting rainwater in large reservoirs called. But their agricultural system, supporting a population that had grown immensely, was finely tuned to a specific rainfall pattern. The prolonged droughts broke that tuning completely. Reservoir levels plummeted, springs dried up. The intricate system of canals and managed fields that fed the urban populations began to fail. Imagine the slow, mounting crisis as harvest after harvest diminished. A society operating at its ecological limits had no buffer against such a shock. Food stores would have been exhausted, leading to widespread hardship and illness. The social contract, which bound commoners to kings who were seen as divine intermediaries responsible for ensuring rain and fertility, would have shattered. If the king in his palace atop a giant pyramid could not bring the rains, what was the point of offering labor and loyalty? This environmental catastrophe triggered a political and social avalanche. The central authority of the royal courts collapsed under the strain of unmet needs. Trade networks that distributed goods across the region faltered. In the face of scarcity, people made a logical, if heartbreaking, choice. They voted with their feet. Families and communities gradually dispersed from the great ceremonial centers, moving towards the coasts or to smaller, more sustainable settlements in search of reliable water and food. The rivalry between Tikal and became meaningless when the ultimate prize, a functioning kingdom, was no longer possible to maintain. The stone stelae ceased to be carved, marking an end to the dynastic histories. The rainforest, patient and relentless, began its slow work of reclaiming the stone pyramids and palaces. The abandonment was not a single event, but a protracted unraveling driven by a changing sky. The story of these two rival capitals teaches us that even the most intense human conflicts can be rendered obsolete by a greater force. When the climate itself turns against a civilization, no amount of political power or architectural genius can hold a society together. The empty courtyards of Tikal stand as a testament to a world that thrived in balance with nature for centuries, until the balance itself was lost. The collapse of the Maya world reveals a civilization undone by a failing sky. Far to the north, in the rocky highlands of ancient Anatolia, another imperial capital met a fiery end under a similar atmospheric siege. The mighty heart of the Hittite Empire was a fortress city of staggering scale, its cyclopean stone walls and monumental gateways projecting an image of unshakable power. For centuries, it commanded an empire that rivaled Egypt and Assyria, a realm built on military might, sophisticated diplomacy recorded on clay tablets, and control over vital trade routes. Yet around the year 1200 before Common Era, this great capital was violently burned and abandoned, its libraries of cuneiform tablets baked in the flames, left as a puzzle for future archaeologists. The traditional narrative points to invasion by mysterious sea peoples or internal rebellion, but a growing body of evidence points to a more insidious enemy that crippled the empire from within. Translations of Hittite diplomatic correspondence from this period reveal increasingly desperate pleas. Letters to allies in Egypt and elsewhere speak not of battlefield losses, but of a profound and persistent crisis, a severe shortage of grain. The texts beg for shipments of food, stating plainly that their people are dying. This is not the language of a temporary setback, but of a state facing systemic famine. Modern science provides the climatic context for these ancient cries for help. Paleoclimate data from tree rings and lake sediments across the eastern Mediterranean and Anatolia paint a stark picture of the late Bronze Age. The period was marked by a prolonged and severe drought, one that lasted for decades, perhaps even centuries. This was not a single dry year, but a fundamental shift that parched the very agricultural heartland of the Hittite state. The empire's power was concentrated in the Central Plateau, a region with limited natural rainfall that relied on a delicate balance. Prolonged drought would have caused repeated harvest failures, draining the royal granaries that fed the massive population of, and most critically, supplied the professional army that was the empire's backbone. A soldier cannot march on an empty stomach, and a king cannot command loyalty when he cannot command bread. The climate stress triggered a devastating chain reaction. As famine spread, the central authority's primary duty to ensure the welfare of its people became impossible to fulfill. This likely sparked internal unrest and migrations of desperate populations, straining social order. The weakened state would have been ill-equipped to respond to external pressures, whether from opportunistic raiders or the larger migratory movements of the era. The magnificent walls designed to repel armies were useless against the creeping, invisible threat of drought. The burning of the city, then, may not have been the cause of the collapse, but its final, dramatic symptom. It was the last act of a failing system, perhaps an intentional destruction by retreating forces or a final conflagration during a takeover the empire was too enfeebled to prevent. Its fate underscores a brutal reality of the ancient world, that even the most formidable military and political machinery could be immobilized by ecological failure. The empire did not simply fall to a stronger sword, it withered from a lack of rain, its great capital left as a smoldering testament to the fact that no amount of fortification can protect a civilization from a changing sky. While the Hittites watched their grain wither under a relentless sun, another civilization was performing an even more daring act of defiance against the desert. In the heart of what is now the Libyan Sahara, a place we perceive as one of the most inhospitable on earth, the Bilta capital, was not a modest outpost, but a thriving urban center with multi-story buildings, a written language, and a culture that dominated trans-Saharan trade for over 1,000 years. Their secret was not a river or reliable rain, but a hidden ocean beneath their feet. They mastered the art of tapping a fossil aquifer, water trapped in underground rock layers from a wetter climatic epoch thousands of years in the past. To bring this ancient water to the surface, they engineered one of history's most remarkable irrigation systems. These were not simple wells. It was a gently sloping underground tunnel sometimes stretching for miles, dug painstakingly through rock and soil to tap the aquifer at a distant foothill. Gravity would then carry the water silently underground to the fields and settlements in the valley below, minimizing evaporation in the blistering desert air. It was a brilliant, sustainable-looking solution that turned patches of the desert green with vineyards, fig orchards, and wheat fields. For centuries, this network of hidden waterways allowed to flourish as an island of abundance in a sea of sand. But their genius contained a fatal flaw. They were living on water savings, not water income. The aquifer was a finite treasure, a buried lake that was not being replenished by the scant rainfall of their era. Every they dug was a withdrawal from an account that would never see another deposit. Generation after generation, they expanded their system, supporting a growing population and increasing agricultural output. They were, in effect, mining water. Over centuries of this extraction, the water table began to fall. Maintaining the system became a desperate and escalating battle. As the aquifer dropped, tunnels had to be dug deeper and longer, requiring exponentially more labor to maintain and clear of collapses. The energy and organization required to keep the water flowing grew and grew. This was a slow-motion crisis, invisible from the sun-baked surface, but relentless beneath it. The gradual depletion of their water source coincided with the naturally continuing of the Sahara. The climate itself offered no reprieve, only increasing the pressure. The agricultural system that defined their civilization became geometrically more difficult to sustain. What choice remained? The slow depletion of the aquifer meant a slow depletion of possibilities. Harvests would have gradually become less reliable, the population that could be supported began to shrink, and the immense social effort required just to maintain the status likely sparked tensions. There was no sudden invasion, no single catastrophic drought to point to. Instead, the lifeblood of simply, quietly, ran thinner year by year. The civilization did not collapse in a day, but it gradually contracted, its people dispersing, its political power evaporating like water under the desert sun. By the time outside forces took note, the great capital was already a shadow, its sophisticated hydraulic network falling into permanent silence. The story of is a profound lesson in understanding the limits of a resource. It shows that a technology, no matter how brilliant, cannot create water where none exists to be renewed. They built a 1,000-year civilization by reaching into the past, but when that past was finally exhausted, their future vanished with it. Their abandoned capital stands as a monument to human ingenuity and a quiet warning about the ultimate cost of drawing down a reserve with no refill in sight. High on the Ethiopian plateau, the stone obelisks of Aksum once cast long shadows over a kingdom of immense wealth and reach. From its capital city, also named Aksum, this empire commanded trade routes linking the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean, its coins circulating from Rome to India. Its power was built on the rich, volcanic soils of the highlands, which supported intensive plow agriculture, feeding a populous urban center and fueling ambitious construction projects. The city's skyline was defined by towering stone stelae, some over 100 feet tall, monuments that required not just incredible engineering skill, but an enormous amount of timber. To shape, move, and erect these granite giants, vast wooden frameworks and rollers were essential. This demand for wood was only one part of a growing hunger. The city's expanding population needed fuel for daily cooking and heating. More critically, the empire's advanced ironworking industry, which produced the tools and weapons of its power, was a voracious consumer of charcoal. For centuries, the forested hills surrounding the capital were steadily cleared to meet these relentless needs. This was not a simple harvest, it was a fundamental transformation of the landscape. The trees that once anchored the soil with their roots were gone. When the seasonal rains swept across the highlands, as they do every year, they now met bare, sloping earth. Without the forest canopy to break the force of the downpour, and without roots to hold the earth in place, the fertile topsoil began to wash away. This was a slow, silent catastrophe. The very richness of the land that had given Aksum its strength was now being carried downhill by every storm. The consequences unfolded in two devastating waves. First, the agricultural fields on the hillsides themselves lost their productivity, their nutrient-rich layer stripped away to expose subsoil. Second, all that eroded soil had to go somewhere. It washed into the valleys and rivers, causing severe siltation. Irrigation channels and reservoirs critical for farming became clogged with mud, reducing their capacity and efficiency. The land's carrying capacity, the number of people it could reliably support, began a long, irreversible decline. The empire did not collapse overnight. Political power and economic activity gradually shifted away from the heartland, moving south to regions with more intact environments. The capital's influence waned as its ecological foundation crumbled literally beneath it. The great stelae, symbols of a civilization that could move mountains of stone, now stood guard over a landscape that could no longer sustain the society that built them. Aksum's story is a powerful example of a civilization mining its own ecological capital. They drew down the forest, a renewable resource, faster than it could regrow, and in doing so, they triggered a chain reaction that degraded the very agricultural system their wealth was built upon. It reminds us that a society's most vital infrastructure is not always made of stone or metal. Sometimes, it is simply the living, rooted earth. The story of water's betrayal repeats itself along the banks of a different, mighty river. In the vast floodplain of the Indus River, two names echo through time as symbols of one of humanity's earliest urban experiments, and Harappa. These were not organic clusters of huts, but masterpieces of pre-planned civic design, laid out on precise grids with standardized brick, advanced drainage systems, and great communal granaries. For centuries, this Indus Valley civilization thrived in remarkable harmony, its influence stretching across a territory larger than ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. Yet by around 1900 before Common Era, the great urban hearts of this civilization were being stilled. The streets of, once bustling with traders and artisans, grew quiet. The central citadels, which held the symbols of civic authority, were gradually abandoned. Unlike other collapses marked by invasion or fire, there is little evidence of violent destruction here. Instead, the archaeology suggests a slow, deliberate departure. The prevailing explanation for this quiet exit points not to enemies, but to the earth itself moving beneath their feet. Geological and sediment studies in the region tell a story of profound instability. The Indus River basin sits in a seismically active zone, where the slow but monumental grinding of tectonic plates can literally reshape the landscape over centuries. Researchers propose that a series of major tectonic events, uplifts of the land, caused the river and its vital tributaries to shift their courses dramatically. Imagine the lifeline of your entire world, the source of water for drinking, for washing, for the clay that made your bricks, suddenly beginning to wander away from your city. One year, the annual flood that deposited rich, renewing silt on the fields might fail to arrive. Another year, it might arrive with catastrophic force, breaching banks and inundating the lower city districts with water and destructive sediments. The river became unreliable, a partner turned unpredictable. This environmental instability struck at the twin pillars of the civilization's success. First, it devastated the agricultural foundation. The meticulously managed fields, dependent on predictable flooding and irrigation from river channels, would have faced repeated failures, either from drought or from being buried under unproductive sand and gravel from flood surges. The granaries, those symbols of surplus and security, would have emptied. Second, it shattered the trade networks that connected these cities to a wider world. The Indus River was their highway. Goods like carnelian beads, cotton cloth, and precious metals moved along its length. If the river shifted away from a major port city that city instantly lost its economic reason for being. It became a terminus with no road. The response to this creeping crisis was not a dramatic last stand, but a pragmatic, community-by-community adaptation. Faced with an environment that could no longer support dense urban populations, people made a logical choice. They began a gradual migration away from the grand, now dysfunctional urban centers. They moved to smaller, more flexible settlements on the fringes of the changed river system, places where they could practice smaller-scale farming and herding. The great urban experiment, with its standardized weights and city-wide baths, required a scale of coordination and surplus that the new, unpredictable landscape could no longer provide. The authority vested in the citadels faded because it could no longer solve the core problem, guaranteeing food and economic stability. So the people left, taking their culture and knowledge with them, but leaving the empty shells of their magnificent cities behind. The silence that fell over is perhaps the most eloquent of all. It speaks of a civilization that did not fall to the sword, but simply walked away from a partnership with nature that the earth itself had broken. The desert coast of Peru seems an unlikely place to build a civilization of plenty. Yet here, the Moche people created a kingdom of astonishing artistry and power, their capital anchored by the colossal adobe brick pyramid known as the Del Sol. This was a society that mastered the art of survival in a rainless landscape, channeling water from distant Andean rivers through intricate networks of canals to create lush, productive valleys in the sand. Theirs was a world of precise ritual and vivid ceramic art, a culture finely tuned to the rhythms of a dry but predictable environment. Then, in the 6th century, that predictability shattered. Deep within the layers of sediment along the coast, geologists have uncovered a story written in mud and sand, evidence of a climatic monster known today as a super L. This was not the periodic warming of Pacific waters we recognize now, but a cataclysmic event of staggering magnitude. For a civilization built in a desert, the first blow came not from drought, but from a drowning. The altered Pacific weather patterns unleashed torrential rains of biblical proportions on the arid coast. These were rains the landscape had no memory of and no capacity to absorb. Normally dry riverbeds, became raging torrents. The meticulously engineered irrigation canals, the very arteries of Moche life, were first overwhelmed and then obliterated, scoured away by floodwaters or buried under meters of debris. The Del Sol itself suffered massive erosion, with entire sections of its adobe brick facade washed into surreal, melted shapes. The agricultural fields, the source of maize, beans, and cotton, were not watered. They were annihilated, buried under sterile gravel and silt, or simply washed out to sea. The initial flood was a single, terrifying event, but the Super L had a second, more insidious phase. After the deluge came a prolonged and severe drought, a period of years where the already traumatized landscape received virtually no moisture at all, even from the reliable mountain-fed rivers that may have also been affected. This 1-2 punch of environmental extremes left the Moche with no way to recover. You cannot rebuild a canal system without water, and you cannot regrow a food supply when the soil itself has been scraped away or lies parched and cracked. The social contract of the Moche world, likely centered on priest-kings who mediated with the gods to ensure water and fertility, would have evaporated faster than the last puddles in the desert. If the rulers in their pyramid could not prevent such a catastrophe or lead an effective recovery, their divine authority was broken. The archaeological record suggests not a slow migration, but a dramatic fragmentation. The great capital at the Del Sol was largely abandoned. In the aftermath, new, smaller centers emerged in different valleys, perhaps led by new factions, but the unified political and cultural force of the Moche was never the same. Their collapse is a stark lesson in vulnerability to climatic volatility. They had optimized their entire society for a specific, dry reality. When the sky delivered its opposite, first in a devastating flood and then in a crushing drought, their mastery turned to dust. The ruined profile of the Del Sol stands not just as a monument to what they built, but as a permanent silhouette against the sky, a reminder of the awesome power of a changed climate to rewrite a civilization's destiny in a single, unforgiving season. Canyon stands as a silent symphony in stone, a network of great houses and celestial alignments built by the ancestral in the high desert of the American Southwest. This was not a city of dense housing, but a grand ceremonial and economic hub, a place where people from across the region would gather for trade, ritual, and community. Its monumental architecture, like the sprawling Pueblo Bonito with its hundreds of rooms and precise solar and lunar markers, speaks of a sophisticated society deeply connected to the cycles of the sky and the earth. For over 300 years, was the spiritual and gravitational center of a vast cultural world. Yet, by the middle of the 12th century, this central place was largely emptied, its great kivas falling into disuse. The reason for this exodus is written in the very trees and soil of the canyon itself. Scientists studying the growth rings of ancient timbers have uncovered a climatic horror story, a 50-year that gripped the region starting around the year 1130. 5 consecutive decades of profoundly diminished rainfall. In an environment where every drop of water was already precious, this was not a hardship, it was an existential sentence. The delicate desert ecology, which the ancestral had learned to harness through careful dry farming and water management techniques, was pushed beyond its breaking point. Springs dried up, and the thin margins of agricultural success vanished. But the drought did not act alone. To build the monumental great houses of, its people needed enormous amounts of timber. The massive roof beams, some over 20 feet long and weighing tons, were primarily ponderosa pine, hauled from mountains over 50 miles away. But for daily life, for fuel for cooking and heating through cold desert nights, the local landscape was stripped. The juniper forests that once held the canyon's soils in place were clear-cut. This deforestation set in motion a slow, ecological unraveling. Without the network of roots to anchor it, the thin topsoil began to erode with every windstorm and the rare but violent downpour. The land's ability to retain what little moisture did fall was severely diminished. The combined effect was a local ecological collapse. The drought meant no water was coming in, and the deforestation meant the land could no longer hold onto what it received. Food production, always a delicate balance, became impossible on the scale needed to support the gatherings and the permanent custodial population of the canyon. The social and spiritual power of was rooted in its ability to be a place of abundance and connection. As scarcity took hold, that power faded. The response was not a sudden panic, but a deliberate, community-based adaptation. Over generations, the population dispersed from the central canyon, migrating to new areas with more reliable water sources, like the mesa tops and river valleys that would later become sites like Mesa Verde and the Hopi Mesas. They took their knowledge, their ceremonies, and their social structures with them, adapting to new homes. Was not abandoned out of failure, but out of resilience, a strategic retreat from a center that the changing climate and their own resource needs had rendered unsustainable. The empty great houses, aligned so perfectly with the solstice sun, remain as a testament to a profound understanding of the cosmos, and a sobering lesson in the earthly limits that even the most spiritually attuned society must ultimately face. King IV made a bold and decisive gamble. In the early 10th century, he broke from the established power center of Angkor and moved the entire imperial capital to a new site, 100 kilometers to the northeast. He called it Kur. This was not a gradual expansion, but a deliberate and total relocation, an attempt to forge a new heart for the Khmer Empire away from the old networks. The king poured his resources into this fresh start, constructing a monumental new temple mountain and a sprawling complex of sanctuaries, all in a remarkably short span of time. Kur rose with astonishing speed, a testament to concentrated royal will, but this very speed may have hidden a critical flaw. The new capital was situated in a region of rugged hills and seasonal streams, far from the life-giving hydrological engine of the Sap Lake and the intricate, time-tested canal network of Angkor. Instead of tapping into a vast, managed system, Kur relied on a series of large man-made reservoirs, or fed by local rainfall and runoff from the surrounding high ground. This was a more isolated, more precarious water strategy. Its success depended heavily on consistent, predictable rainfall patterns to keep these reservoirs filled. When the rains were plentiful, the city could flourish, its fields irrigated, and its population sustained. But this system lacked the resilience and scale of Angkor's connection to a massive lake and river system. It was a hydraulic gamble, betting the future of a capital on a local water catchment that could be far more vulnerable to the whims of climate. Historical and archaeological evidence suggests this gamble may have had dire consequences. The period following the Fourth's reign coincides with what some climate records indicate were drier intervals. A series of droughts would have struck at the very foundation of Ker's existence. Its reservoirs, the sole source of water for agriculture and daily life, would have dropped perilously low. The agricultural surplus needed to support the labor force for its grand construction projects and to feed its urban population would have evaporated. The city's, its ability to function as a sustainable imperial center was called into question. It is perhaps no coincidence, then, that after the king's passing, the political will to maintain this risky outpost evaporated as quickly as its water stores. His successor, the second, made a decisive and telling move. He abandoned the ambitious project at Ker and returned the capital to the Angkor region, to the proven, expansive hydraulic landscape that had supported power for generations. Ker was left, not as a ruined city conquered by enemies, but as a magnificent and half-finished experiment. Its rapid rise and even faster abandonment speak to a profound lesson in statecraft and environmental planning. A king could command the movement of thousands and the construction of pyramids, but he could not command the rains. A capital built on a fragile water system, no matter how grand its temples, was a capital built on sand. The silent towers of Ker stand as a monument to a king's ambition, and a stark reminder that the most brilliant political visions can be undone by a simple, relentless lack of water. At an altitude where the air grows thin, the capital stood as a marvel of high-altitude adaptation. On the shores of lake, this city of monumental stone gateways and carved monoliths was the spiritual and political center of an empire that predated the Inca. Its people thrived in an environment many would consider harsh, mastering a unique agricultural technology known as. These were not simple fields, but sophisticated, raised garden beds separated by canals of water. The system was a stroke of genius. The water in the canals absorbed heat from the intense sun during the day and slowly released it at night, creating a protective microclimate that shielded crops from the frequent frosts of the high plains. The lake itself was the system's lifeblood, its steady level feeding the network of canals that made the desert plateau bloom with potatoes, quinoa, and other hardy crops. For centuries, this symbiotic relationship between city and lake supported a complex society of artisans, priests, and farmers. Then, the partnership was broken by a changing sky. Paleoclimate data drawn from lakebed cores tells a story of a profound and prolonged drought that gripped the region for nearly 200 years, from the 10th into the 11th centuries. As the rains failed year after year, the vast, shallow bowl of lake began to shrink. Its shoreline receded slowly but inexorably, pulling away from the intricate agricultural grids that depended on it. Imagine the slow-motion disaster as the canals connecting to the lake's edge first ran low, then ran completely dry. The raised fields, engineered for a precise balance of water and warmth, were left stranded, their protective microclimate collapsing. The crops that fed the empire would have faltered, then failed. This was not a single bad harvest, but a systemic, multi-generational agricultural collapse. The central authority in the Stone City derived its power from its perceived role as an intermediary with the gods who controlled weather and fertility, and from its practical role in managing the food surplus. As famine took hold, both sources of legitimacy evaporated. The state could not distribute what it did not have, and its rituals could not bring back the rains. The social fabric, woven around the bounty of the lake, began to unravel. The great ceremonial center, with its famous sun gate and monolithic figures, was gradually abandoned. People likely dispersed into smaller, more mobile family groups, retreating into the higher valleys in search of reliable springs and streams, reverting to a simpler way of life that the grand state could no longer sustain. Silence is a powerful testament to a simple, brutal geographic truth. Even the most ingenious human engineering is tethered to its source. When the lake retreated, it did not just change a shoreline, it severed the physical and spiritual connection that sustained an empire, leaving its stone wonders to gaze out over a landscape that could no longer support the civilization that built them. The great citadels of Mycenae and their massive stone walls built by giants of legend were designed to withstand any siege. Yet the enemy that breached them left no battering ram at the gate. Across the Greek mainland, the palatial centers of Mycenaean civilization, from the Lion Gate at Mycenae to the vast storerooms of, fell into ruin around 1200 before Common Era. This was not a single event, but a widespread systemic failure known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, a time when the lights of complex society seemed to blink out across the eastern Mediterranean. For decades, historians pointed to invasions, rebellions, or mysterious sea peoples as the cause. But modern science has uncovered a more pervasive culprit, one that left its signature not in weapon marks, but in the very rings of ancient trees. Paleoclimate data from the region reveals a period of severe, prolonged drought. This was not a few dry years, it was a climatic shift that parched the agricultural heartlands for a generation or more. The Mycenaean economy was a palatial system, a tightly controlled network where the central authority in each fortress city collected and redistributed grain, olive oil, and other goods. Recorded on clay tablets in an early script called Linear B, this system supported specialized artisans, a warrior elite, and the grand projects of the state. Its stability depended entirely on a reliable agricultural surplus. The prolonged drought struck at this foundation with devastating force. Harvests failed year after year. The palace storerooms, meant to buffer against a single bad season, were drained and could not be refilled. This scarcity rippled through every layer of society. Trade, the other pillar of Mycenaean wealth, also faltered. The same climatic stress was crippling partner empires like the Hittites, drying up the exchange of luxury goods, metals, and ideas that sustained the elite's prestige and power. Famine began to spread. The social contract, which exchanged commoner labor for the security and organization provided by the palace, shattered under the weight of empty bellies. The ruling class, and his administrators, lost their legitimacy when they could no longer fulfill their most basic duty, feeding the people. In such an atmosphere, internal conflict became inevitable. Tensions between the palace and outlying communities, or between different factions within the elite, likely boiled over into violence. The archaeological record shows that many of these great centers, were violently burned. This burning may not have been the act of an external conqueror, but the final, fiery symptom of internal collapse, a desperate act during a revolt or a deliberate destruction by a retreating elite who would not leave their wealth for others. The result was a swift and total depopulation. With the palatial system in ashes and the land unable to support a concentrated population, people had no reason to stay in the shadow of the burned citadels. They dispersed, likely moving to smaller, more sustainable hilltop settlements or reverting to a simpler, pastoral way of life. The knowledge of writing, of large-scale administration, of intricate fresco painting was lost for centuries. The thick walls of Mycenae, which had stood against armies, proved useless against the slow, invisible pressure of a changing climate. Their abandonment teaches us that even the most formidable and hierarchical systems have a hidden fragility. When the environment withdraws its bounty, it can unravel the complex social fabric of a civilization in a remarkably short time, leaving only silent stone giants to guard over a landscape that had turned against its kings. The silence that fell over the Mycenaean citadels was a product of drought, a shared climate shock across a connected world. But on the most isolated inhabited island on Earth, a different kind of silence descended, one born not from a changing sky, but from the slow, deliberate consumption of every tree. Easter Island, or is a speck of volcanic rock in the vast Pacific, over 2,000 kilometers from the nearest land. Its story is perhaps the most famous parable of ecological overreach in human history. For centuries, this remote community thrived, developing a unique and powerful culture centered on the creation of those iconic stone giants that gaze inland from coastal platforms. In the island's later period, the ceremonial village became its effective capital. Perched on the rim of a volcanic crater high above the sea, was not a city of dwellings, but a sacred site of stone houses built into the cliffside, dedicated entirely to the Birdman cult. This was a ritual of renewal and leadership, where competitors would scale down sheer cliffs, swim through shark-infested waters to a distant islet, and wait for the first sooty tern egg of the season. The winner's patron would be declared the Birdman, granting his lineage spiritual and political authority for the year. This ritual, focused on the arrival of migratory birds, speaks to a society deeply aware of cycles and renewal. Yet, the very foundation of that society was being systematically dismantled. The well-established narrative, supported by pollen analysis from lake sediments, tells a stark story of deforestation. To move the massive from the quarry to their coastal platforms, the islanders likely used a combination of log rollers and rope fashioned from tree bark. Each statue's journey required a staggering amount of timber, but the trees were not just felled for statue transport. They were cleared for agriculture to feed a growing population, used as fuel, and for building canoes essential for fishing in the deep waters beyond the reef. The island's once lush palm forest was being harvested at a rate far beyond its ability to regenerate. This was a slow-motion catastrophe with cascading consequences. Without tree roots to anchor the soil, the thin, fertile topsoil eroded away with wind and rain, reducing agricultural yields. The loss of the large palm trees meant the end of building seaworthy canoes. The islanders were trapped, unable to fish for the larger, open-ocean species that had once supplemented their diet. The food web collapsed inward, putting immense pressure on land birds and, tragically, leading to the extinction of every native terrestrial animal. The society, once complex and stratified, was plunged into a desperate struggle for dwindling resources. In this context, the ritual takes on a haunting new meaning. The Birdman cult, focused on a scarce egg from a migratory bird, emerged as the old order, symbolized by the static, faltered. It was a shift from ancestor worship to a competition for a sliver of hope, a new system of authority born from crisis. But no ritual could summon back a forest that was gone. With no timber, no deep-sea fish, and degraded soils, the population plummeted through hardship and conflict. The central authority that represented became unsustainable because there was simply not enough left to manage, not enough surplus to support leaders, priests, or craftsmen. The stone houses looking out over an empty ocean, were abandoned to the wind. The lesson is not one of a foolish people, but of a society that, in isolation, could not see the limit until they had passed it. They did not have the perspective to understand they were living on a closed system with no possibility of resupply. Each generation made reasonable choices, using the resources at hand to honor their ancestors and feed their families, but the cumulative effect over centuries was a total drawdown of their island's natural capital. Their story stands as a powerful, haunting reminder of a fundamental ecological truth, that on a finite planet, growth cannot be infinite. The silence that followed was the sound of an account balance reaching zero. The desert holds a special kind of silence, but the city of Petra was built to defy it. Carved into the rose-red cliffs of southern Jordan, this Nabatean capital was a masterpiece of arid survival, a bustling nexus where incense, silk, and spice caravans converged. Its wealth was legendary, yet its true genius lay hidden in the rock. The Nabateans were hydrological artists. They engineered an intricate network of channels, dams, and cisterns that captured every precious drop of seasonal rainfall, channeling flash floods into reservoirs and storing water for the dry months. This system turned a narrow canyon into a lush, defensible oasis, supporting a population of thousands and creating the surplus that allowed them to carve monumental tombs like the treasury directly from the cliff face. Petra's power was not just in its location on trade routes, but in its command over the one resource the desert could not provide: reliable water. For centuries, this balance held. Then, the world began to change around it. The rise of maritime trade under the Roman Empire meant that goods could travel by ship across the Red Sea and up the Nile, bypassing the arduous and expensive overland caravan routes that were Petra's lifeblood. This economic shift was a slow, steady pressure, a gradual tightening of the city's financial veins. But the decisive blow came not from human economics, but from the earth itself. In the year 363, a massive earthquake struck the region. This was not a minor tremor, it was a catastrophic seismic event recorded by historians of the era. The quake's violence struck directly at Petra's heart, its sophisticated water management system. The carefully carved channels and dams that snaked through the canyons were shattered. Cisterns cracked and collapsed. The delicate hydraulic balance that had sustained urban life for generations was broken in a single, violent convulsion. Imagine the aftermath, not just of damaged buildings, but of a broken lifeline. The spring that fed the main conduit, known as the may have been disrupted or its flow diverted. The city's stored water reserves would have been lost or contaminated. In a desert capital, this was not a repairable inconvenience, it was an existential crisis. The earthquake of 363 did not instantly empty Petra, but it delivered a shock from which the city, already adapting to diminished trade, could not fully recover. The immense effort and specialized knowledge required to rebuild the hydraulic infrastructure likely exceeded the capacity of a polity whose economic base was already shrinking. Water scarcity would have forced a gradual depopulation, as maintaining the dense urban core became unsustainable. Political and administrative functions slowly drifted away to other centers with more reliable water. Petra transitioned from a living capital to a ceremonial site, and eventually to a silent city of tombs known only to local Bedouin tribes. Its story reminds us that even the most ingenious human systems are vulnerable to the planet's raw power. The Nabateans had mastered the desert's logic, but they could not fortify their canals against the fault lines deep below. The shift in trade routes altered Petra's purpose, but it was the earthquake that broke its physical ability to be a city, leaving its magnificent facades to gaze out over a canyon where the only sound left was the wind and the memory of flowing water. The furnace fires of burned day and night, a testament to an empire built on iron. As the later capital of the Kingdom of Kush, this city was an industrial powerhouse of the ancient world, its wealth and military might forged in the intense heat of countless smelting furnaces. They had mastered this technology, producing weapons, tools, and trade goods that secured their power along the Nile for centuries. Their pyramids, smaller and steeper than those of Egypt, still stand sentinel over the plains. But this industrial triumph came with a hidden and ultimately unsustainable ecological price. The fuel for those relentless furnaces was charcoal, and producing it required wood, an immense and constant supply of wood. To transform raw ore into usable iron, the smelting process demanded staggering quantities of charcoal, which in turn required the systematic clearing of the acacia forests that once surrounded the city. This was not a minor harvest, it was a wholesale transformation of the landscape. For generations, the demand for fuel drove the deforestation of the region. The trees that once helped stabilize the soil and retain moisture were gone, converted into the charcoal that powered the kingdom's economy. This ecological degradation did not act alone. The kingdom also relied heavily on livestock, and widespread overgrazing by cattle and goats compounded the problem. The combined effect was a slow-motion disaster for the land. Without tree roots to hold it, the topsoil became vulnerable to erosion from wind and the occasional Nile flood. The ground, compacted by hooves and stripped of vegetation, lost its fertility and its ability to absorb water effectively. The result was a gradual but relentless decline in agricultural productivity. The very fields that fed the city's populous ironworkers and soldiers began to yield less. This created a dangerous paradox. The industry that brought its strength was quietly undermining the agricultural foundation that made that strength possible. A kingdom cannot sustain an army or a skilled artisan class on an empty granary. As the land's capacity diminished, the social and economic pressures would have mounted. The central authority may have found it increasingly difficult to manage the competing needs of industry and sustenance. While external pressures from rising powers like Aksum to the east certainly played a role, the internal weakening from ecological exhaustion made the kingdom far more vulnerable. The great ironworks, symbols of innovation, likely fell silent not because the knowledge was lost, but because the fuel to feed them had been exhausted. The capital's influence gradually waned, its political power diffusing until the city itself was eventually abandoned. The story offers a profound lesson about the long-term cost of industrial success. It shows how a society's greatest technological achievement can become the agent of its environmental decline, a reminder that true power requires not just mastery over fire and metal, but a lasting stewardship of the very land that provides the fuel for both. The story of iron's cost reveals a civilization consuming its own landscape. In the humid lowlands of ancient Mexico, the Olmec heartland faced a different kind of environmental betrayal, one that came from both the Earth's movement and its violent exhalations. La Venta was more than a settlement. It was a sacred axis of the Olmec world, a city of immense earthen pyramids and colossal stone heads carved from basalt. Its power was anchored to a vital geographic feature, the mighty river system, which served as its highway for trade, communication, and sustenance. This river was the city's lifeline, bringing in the raw materials for its monuments and facilitating the exchange of goods and ideas across. But rivers, like civilizations, have a history of change. Researchers studying the geology of the region suggest that the may have a significant shift in its course. Over centuries, the natural process of siltation, where sediment builds up in a river channel, can cause it to become choked and unstable. A river may suddenly decide to carve a new path during a seasonal flood, abandoning its old bed. If this happened to the branch of the river that served La Venta, the consequences would have been catastrophic. The city's strategic position would vanish overnight. Its port facilities would be left stranded, a harbor without water. The trade networks that fueled its economy and cultural influence would be severed, as goods could no longer easily reach the city's doorstep. This riverine shift would not just be an inconvenience, it would be a fundamental rewiring of the city's reason for being. Compounding this potential geographical crisis was a threat from the sky. The region surrounding the Olmec heartland is volcanically active. Evidence from soil layers indicates periods in the past when distant eruptions blanketed the area in a fine gray shroud of volcanic ash. For a farmer, it is a double-edged sword. In the long term, it can enrich the soil with minerals. But in the immediate aftermath, it is an agricultural disaster. A thick layer of ash smothers crops, blocking sunlight and preventing growth. It can contaminate water sources and make the land unworkable. Even a light dusting can damage leaves and reduce yields for a season. If a major eruption deposited ash over La Venta's agricultural lands, it could have triggered a sudden and severe food shortage. The city's ability to feed the concentrated population of laborers, artisans, and elites who maintained its ceremonial grandeur would have been thrown into jeopardy. Imagine the combined pressure of these two events, whether they occurred in sequence or overlapped. The river changes course, crippling commerce and perhaps even affecting local fishing and water supply. Then, from the mountains, a veil of ash descends, withering the maize in the fields. The ruling class, whose authority was likely tied to their perceived ability to communicate with the forces of nature and ensure prosperity, would face an impossible crisis. They could not command the river to return to its bed, nor could they stop the volcanoes from speaking. The social and spiritual contract holding the center together would be under immense strain. La Venta's abandonment appears to have been a gradual process, a slow relinquishing of its central role. People likely migrated to other areas with more reliable waterways and undamaged soils. The great stone heads, portraits of powerful rulers, were carefully buried by the Olmec themselves, perhaps in a final act of reverence or ritual closure. The city was not destroyed, but purposefully laid to rest, its political and spiritual energy flowing elsewhere. La Venta's silence speaks to the vulnerability of even the most spiritually potent capitals to the physical realities of their environment. A river's whim and a volcano's breath could together unravel the threads of commerce and sustenance, leaving a sacred landscape to be reclaimed by the forest, its buried giants waiting to be found. The Olmecs faced a river's betrayal and a volcano's ash, yet another Peruvian culture would be undone by a familiar, recurring terror. The also known as the culture built their world on the arid north coast of Peru centuries after the Moche, inheriting a landscape shaped by ancient floods. Their capital at the site we call was a city of pyramids and plazas, but above all, it was a city of metal. There were master metallurgists, their smiths producing a flood of gold, silver, and copper alloys that flowed through vast trade networks, cementing their political and religious power. Their supreme deity was the Lord, often depicted in magnificent masks and ceremonial knives, a figure associated with the life-giving forces of water and fertility. This spiritual focus on abundance made the catastrophe that struck around the year 1100 all the more devastating. Geological layers at it tell a story of sudden, overwhelming violence. Researchers have uncovered evidence of a massive flood event, a wall of water and debris that swept through the sacred precinct, burying temples, workshops, and residential areas under meters of sterile sand and gravel. The scale of the sediment deposit points to a cataclysm of almost unimaginable force, one that geologists and archaeologists link directly to another super-El event. This was not a gentle rise of river levels, but a torrential onslaught from the nearby mountains, unleashed when the altered Pacific climate dumped unprecedented rains on the highlands. The floodwaters would have scoured the landscape, obliterating the intricate irrigation canals that fed the city's agriculture. It buried the very foundations of religious authority, the temples where priests communicated with the Lord to ensure water and prosperity. The city's infrastructure, from its adobe brick pyramids to its metalworking districts, was not just damaged, it was entombed. In the aftermath, the spiritual and political calculus for the elite was irrevocably changed. If their gods, in these now buried temples, could not protect the heart of the civilization from such a disaster, then perhaps the gods themselves had turned away or demanded a new home. The response was not to rebuild upon the ruins, but to perform a deliberate, symbolic relocation. The capital was moved a significant distance away to a new site called. This was more than a practical move. It was a profound ritual act, an attempt to leave a cursed or forsaken landscape behind and establish a fresh covenant with the divine in a place untouched by the flood's memory. Was abandoned, its pyramids becoming lonely hills in the desert, its brilliant metalworking traditions silenced under the sand. This event underscores a haunting pattern along the Peruvian coast, where civilizations rose by mastering a dry climate, only to be periodically erased by the ocean's chaotic breath. They learned that their greatest technological artistry was powerless against the sky's occasional fury, a lesson written in layers of sediment that sealed a golden capital's fate. Their golden capital was buried by a flood, but a colder, slower crisis awaited a colony at the top of the world. On the remote western coast of Greenland, the Vikings established two settlements they simply called the Eastern and Western settlements. For over 400 years, these were not just outposts, but functioning Norse colonial capitals, complete with stone churches, a bishop's seat, and farmsteads modeled on the Scandinavian homeland. They raised cattle and sheep, held local assemblies called things, and maintained a precarious but vital trade linked to Europe, exporting walrus ivory and hides in exchange for timber, iron, and other essentials. Their society was a remarkable transplant of medieval European life onto the very edge of the habitable world. That transplant, however, was always vulnerable, and its ultimate failure is written in ice. Beginning in the 14th century, the climate of the North Atlantic began to cool significantly, a period now known as the Little Ice Age. For the Greenland Norse, this was not a minor temperature dip, but a fundamental rewriting of their environmental contract. The growing seasons became shorter and less reliable, making it difficult to grow enough fodder to sustain their livestock through the long, dark winters. The pastures that supported their cherished herds of cattle, the very symbol of their European identity, grew more sparse with each passing year. At the same time, the sea ice around Greenland expanded and lingered for longer periods. This was a double catastrophe. It made the already treacherous sea voyage to Iceland and Norway even more dangerous, effectively severing their lifeline to the broader Norse world. The trade that brought them vital resources dwindled to a trickle and then stopped. But the ice also had a more direct ecological impact. It blocked the migration routes of the walrus herds the Norse depended on for their most valuable export, and it may have altered the patterns of seals and other marine mammals they hunted for food. The Norse were caught in a tightening vice. Their pastoral farming model, ill-adapted to the worsening conditions, was failing on land, and their connection to the sea, both for trade and for supplemental hunting, was being choked off by ice. The archaeological record tells a story of a society under immense, prolonged stress. Analysis of skeletal remains shows increasing signs of malnutrition over the final generations. The last vestiges of their diet became desperately lean. They were literally starving for the nutrients their bodies needed. In such a state of scarcity, social cohesion would have frayed. Conflict over dwindling resources likely increased, both within the settlements and possibly with the Inuit peoples who were migrating south into the area, a population far better adapted to the changing Arctic environment. The Norse clung stubbornly to their way of life, their identity tied to their stone churches and their cattle. There is little evidence they adopted the successful survival technologies of the Inuit, such as specialized hunting techniques for ringed seals or the use of kayaks. This cultural inflexibility in the face of a changing world proved fatal. One by one, the farmsteads were abandoned. The last written record of the Norse Greenlanders is a marriage certificate from the Eastern Settlement Church, dated to the early 1400s. After that, only silence. By the mid-15th century, when European ships finally returned to the region, they found only empty stone ruins, the livestock long gone, and the fields reclaimed by the hardy tundra grasses. The settlements were not destroyed by war or invasion, but slowly relinquished to the cold. Their complete abandonment is a stark lesson in the limits of colonial adaptation. It shows how a society can thrive for centuries by exploiting a narrow ecological niche, yet perish when that niche contracts. They did not disappear because of a single catastrophic winter, but because of a relentless, multi-generational squeeze from a cooling climate, a squeeze that their cultural and economic model simply could not withstand. The wind through those empty stone church walls carries the echo of a choice to maintain an old identity at the cost of a future. Before Angkor's vast reservoirs were even conceived, the Khmer world experimented with water on a different canvas. Deep in the Kampong province of Cambodia, the temples rise from the forest, their intricate brickwork adorned with carvings that feel both ancient and elegant. This was the capital of the kingdom, a direct predecessor to the empire, flourishing between the 6th and 9th centuries. Its very name hints at its essence, translates roughly to the temple in the richness of the forest. But that richness was not just in timber, it was in a deliberate, ambitious attempt to harness water. The city's planners designed an elaborate hydraulic system, a network of moats, canals, and large rectangular reservoirs known as. These features were not merely decorative or defensive, they were functional, intended to capture monsoon rainwater and channel it for agriculture and daily use within the urban core. This system represented a profound step forward, a clear recognition that controlling water was the key to sustaining a centralized, powerful state in the monsoon tropics. Yet when compared to what came later at Angkor, it was a prototype. The scale was more localized, focusing on the immediate city and its surrounding lands rather than engineering an entire regional watershed. The reservoirs while impressive, were essentially large ponds dependent on direct rainfall and local runoff. They lacked the sophisticated connection to a massive, permanent lake like the Sap, or the vast, gravity-fed canal networks that would later define Khmer hydroengineering. This earlier model held an inherent vulnerability. Its success was tethered closely to the reliability of local seasonal rains. If those rains failed, or if patterns shifted even slightly, the entire system's buffer was minimal. A prolonged drought would have seen these reservoirs shrink rapidly, putting immediate stress on the city's food production and water supply. The archaeological and climatic timeline suggests this may be precisely what happened. Evidence points to periods of climatic instability during the latter centuries of prominence, including drier intervals that would have tested its hydraulic design to its limits. The system, while brilliant for its time, may have simply been insufficient to weather the more severe climatic shifts that the region occasionally experienced. It was a lesson written in receding water lines and strained harvests. The response to this limitation was not to abandon the principle of water management, but to revolutionize it. The knowledge gained from this earlier experiment, its successes and its shortcomings, directly informed the next chapter. When the political center shifted to the Angkor region, the engineers and rulers did not just replicate, they superseded it. They chose a location with greater natural advantages, near the Great Lake, and designed a system of an entirely different magnitude, one that could store water on a colossal scale and redistribute it across a vast plain. Was not a failure, it was a necessary and instructive precursor. Its eventual fading from prominence as a capital was less about conquest and more about evolution. The kingdom's earlier hydraulic experiment proved that water management was the path to power, but also that a small-scale solution could become a critical vulnerability. The forest-enshrouded temples stand as a beautiful and quiet testament to that learning process, the first draft of a hydraulic idea that would later be written across a landscape in stone and water, on a scale the world had never seen. A kingdom's lifeline can be severed by a handful of soil, washed slowly down a mountain. For the Aksumite Empire, that lifeline was the port of a bustling harbor on the Red Sea coast that served as the economic gateway to the inland capital. Through flowed the wealth of continents, gold and ivory from Africa exchanged for glass, textiles, and spices from Rome, India, and beyond. This port was not just a dock, it was the empire's connection to the wider world, the engine of its cosmopolitan power. Yet the very source of Aksum's inland strength, its highland agriculture, carried the seeds of the port's destruction. As we saw earlier, the demand for timber and fuel in the capital region led to widespread deforestation on the Ethiopian plateau. This loss of tree cover triggered severe soil erosion. With every seasonal rain, tons of fertile topsoil were washed from the denuded hillsides, beginning a long, slow journey downhill. That soil did not simply vanish, it had to go somewhere. Rivers like the, which flowed from the highlands down to the coast, became thick, brown highways of sediment. They carried this immense load of silt and sand all the way to the Red Sea, discharging it directly into the bay that cradled the port of. For decades, then centuries, this process continued, a silent, incremental change. The harbor, which needed to be deep enough to accommodate the large, ocean-going merchant vessels of the era began to fill in. The water grew shallower. What was once a deep, protected anchorage gradually transformed into a silt-choked lagoon. You can picture the growing frustration of ship captains. A vessel that once sailed directly to a stone wharf now found itself running aground on a newly formed mudbank hundreds of feet from shore. Cargo had to be offloaded onto smaller, shallow-draft boats, a time-consuming and expensive process that added risk and cost to every transaction. Over time, the port became simply unusable for the largest and most important trade ships. This was an economic strangulation in slow motion. The flow of goods that taxed and enriched the Aksumite treasury dwindled to a trickle. The empire's relevance on the international stage, built on its role as a trade intermediary, faded. The capital, already grappling with the agricultural consequences of soil loss in its own hinterlands, now faced a second, devastating blow: the collapse of its foreign income. It did not fall to a naval blockade or a hostile fleet, it was suffocated by the land itself. The environmental mismanagement of the highlands, hundreds of kilometers away, wrote its final chapter in the silted harbor. This story reveals a profound and often overlooked truth about interconnected systems. A decision made in an upland forest to cut one more tree for fuel or construction could ripple across an entire economy, eventually silencing the distant clamor of a once great port. The decline did not cause Aksum's fall alone, but it critically weakened the empire, stripping away the wealth it needed to adapt and endure, leaving its rulers isolated in their stone palace, listening to a silence where the sounds of prosperous commerce used to be. The silent canals of the tell a story of water's double-edged gift. In the blistering Sonoran desert of what is now Arizona, this ingenious culture built not with stone, but with earth and water, creating the most extensive and sophisticated irrigation system in prehistoric North America. Their major center was a hub of platform mounds and vibrant craftwork, a testament to a society that had turned a river into a lifeline. For over 1,000 years, they thrived by channeling the waters of the and salt rivers through hundreds of miles of hand-dug canals, some wide enough for a modern car to drive through. They transformed the desert floor into lush, productive fields of maize, beans, and cotton, supporting sizable villages and a complex social order. Their success was a monument to human persistence in a harsh land, a constant dialogue with the flow of a river. But that dialogue had a hidden, chemical consequence. In an arid environment like the Sonoran Desert, rainfall is too scarce to naturally flush the soil. When river water is used for irrigation, it contains dissolved salts. As the water evaporates from the fields or is taken up by plants, those salts are left behind in the earth. For generations, this process is manageable. But over centuries, the salts accumulate, slowly concentrating in the root zones of the crops. This is salinization, a silent, incremental poisoning of the land. Masters of moving water were unknowingly fighting a battle they could not see. With each planting season, a little more salt was deposited, year after year, decade after decade. The effects are devastatingly simple. As salt levels rise, plants struggle to absorb water. They become stunted, their yields drop, and eventually nothing will grow at all. The very fields that fed and fueled its culture were gradually becoming toxic. This was not a sudden crisis, but a slow, generational decline. A farmer might notice his harvest was a little smaller than his grandfather's, but the cause was invisible, baked into the very soil he depended on. Compounding this, maintaining those vast canal networks against the desert's relentless siltation required enormous, coordinated labor. As crop yields dwindled due to salinization, the surplus food needed to support that organized labor force would have also diminished. It created a vicious cycle. Less food meant less ability to maintain the canals, and poorly maintained canals delivered water less efficiently, perhaps exacerbating the salt buildup in some areas. The land's generosity was being withdrawn, teaspoon by toxic teaspoon, over hundreds of years. By around 1400, the great center of was largely abandoned. The people did not vanish, but they dispersed, likely reorganizing into smaller, more mobile communities that relied less on intensive canal irrigation and more on diverse, desert-adapted strategies. The Grand fell silent, and the intricate network of canals slowly filled with desert sand. Their story is a profound lesson in the long-term chemistry of survival. They solved the immediate, visible problem, bringing water to the desert, but the solution itself carried an invisible cost that unfolded on a timescale longer than a human life. It reminds us that true sustainability requires understanding not just the resource, but the full, slow-motion consequence of its use. The empty basins of canals are not just ditches in the dirt. They are the fossilized signature of a bargain with nature, one where the price, paid in salt, eventually came due. The silent canals of the show us a crisis of slow chemistry, but some environmental catastrophes arrive with the force of a world ending. On the island of Crete, the Minoan civilization built not a single capital, but a network of magnificent palatial centers like Knossos, and these were not fortified citadels, but sprawling, multi-story complexes adorned with vivid frescoes of dolphins and bull-leaping rituals, the administrative and religious hearts of a maritime empire. The Minoans were the undisputed masters of the Bronze Age Aegean, their sleek ships controlling trade routes across the eastern Mediterranean. Their power and identity were inseparable from the sea. Then, around the year 1600 before Common Era, the sea turned against them with a violence beyond comprehension. 70 miles north of Crete, the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini, detonated in one of the largest eruptions in human history. The scale is almost impossible to grasp. Geologists estimate it was many times more powerful than the eruption of Krakatoa. The initial cataclysm would have been visible from Crete, a towering column of ash and superheated gas punching into the stratosphere. But the true devastation came from what followed. The partial collapse of the volcanic cone into the emptied magma chamber triggered a tsunami of staggering proportions. A wall of water, perhaps hundreds of feet high, radiated outward across the Aegean. Within an hour, it would have reached the northern coast of Crete, the very location of many Minoan harbors, fleet bases, and coastal settlements. The wave would have scoured everything in its path, smashing the dockyards and warehouses that were the logistical backbone of there. The Minoan navy, the source of their wealth and security, would have been utterly destroyed, either pulled out to sea or smashed against the shore. But the disaster was multi-layered. Following the tsunami came the ash. Prevailing winds carried a thick blanket of volcanic fallout across eastern Crete. This ash fall had a dual effect. In the immediate term, it smothered fields, contaminating water sources and collapsing roofs under its weight. It would have caused a total, if temporary, agricultural collapse, but the eruption's impact may have stretched far beyond a single season. The immense volume of sulfur dioxide and ash injected into the upper atmosphere could have triggered a volcanic winter, leading to several years of cooler temperatures, failed harvests, and unseasonable weather across the entire region. For a society already reeling from the direct physical destruction, this prolonged climatic shock would have been a death blow. The intricate, centralized economy of the palaces, which collected and redistributed goods like olive oil, wine, and textiles, depended on agricultural surplus and long-distance trade. Both were now severed. The authority of the priest-kings in their colorful palaces, who were seen as responsible for ensuring prosperity, evaporated in the face of such cosmic disorder. In the power vacuum that followed, a new force emerged from the Greek mainland, the Mycenaeans. These were a warrior culture, already familiar with Minoan goods and ideas through trade. In the generations after the eruption, archaeological evidence shows a clear Mycenaean presence growing within the damaged palaces, especially at Knossos. It was not a sudden, violent conquest, but a gradual takeover, a filling of empty space. The Minoan script, Linear A, was replaced by the Mycenaean Linear B. The vibrant, naturalistic art gave way to more martial imagery. The great palaces were repaired and reused, but under a new, foreign management. The Minoan world did not vanish in a day, but the Thera eruption broke its spine. It destroyed its fleet, crippled its economy, and shattered the spiritual confidence of its people. The disaster created not a blank slate, but a weakened one, perfectly positioned for a more resilient, land-based power to step in. The haunting, unfinished ruins of Thera itself, buried in ash, give us a frozen moment of the catastrophe. But the silent, repurposed halls of Knossos tell the longer story of a brilliant maritime culture whose destiny was rewritten by the fire and water of a single, furious mountain. The Minoan world was shattered by a single, furious mountain. In the highlands of central Mexico, the Toltec capital of Tula faced a different kind of unraveling, a slow fracture from within under the pressure of a drying sky. Tula was more than a city, it was a legend, the place from which later empires like the Aztecs claimed their cultural and political lineage. Its grand plaza was dominated by the Temple of the Morning Star, fronted by colossal stone statues of warriors, the famed Atlantean columns. This was the heart of an empire built on military prowess, sophisticated craftsmanship, and a powerful cult of the feathered serpent god. For 2 centuries, Tula stood as the premier power in the region, its influence radiating out through trade and ideology. But its dominance was built on a foundation of maize agriculture, and that foundation was about to crumble. Paleoclimate records from lake sediments in central Mexico tell a story of profound aridity. In the 12th century, the region was struck by a series of severe, multi-decade droughts. Rainfall patterns grew unreliable, and the springs and streams that fed Tula's fields began to diminish. You can see the physical evidence of this strain in the city's own infrastructure, where archaeologists have found signs of increasingly desperate efforts to manage water, with canals and channels being rerouted and modified in ways that suggest scarcity, not abundance. A city built to project eternal power was now grappling with a basic mortal need. When the rains fail in an agricultural society, everything becomes a competition for what remains. The stored grain in the royal granaries, the water in the managed reservoirs, the very legitimacy of the ruling class, all of it is called into question. In Tula, this environmental stress appears to have acted as a catalyst, igniting long-simmering social and political tensions. The Toltec state was likely not a monolithic entity, but a coalition of different factions, perhaps rival noble houses or cults dedicated to different aspects of their pantheon. The feathered serpent priesthood of, which emphasized peace and knowledge, may have been in a delicate balance with more militant groups devoted to gods of warlike. In times of plenty, such balances can hold. In times of famine, they break. As resources dwindled, the competition for control over them would have turned fierce. The ruling elites claimed to divine favor, their right to rule because they ensured fertility and abundance, would have evaporated with the parched crops. Different factions likely blamed each other for the calamity, each proposing different solutions or accusing the other of having lost the gods' favor. The archaeological record at Tula reveals a moment of violent rupture. The main temple pyramid, the symbolic and religious core of the city, was deliberately burned. This was not an accidental fire, but a targeted act of destruction. The scorched stones and layers of ash speak of a profound internal convulsion, a ritual killing of the city's own heart. This burning was likely the climax of a factional conflict that turned the city against itself. One group, perhaps feeling betrayed or seeking to break the power of their rivals, set the temple ablaze. It was an act that shattered the social contract utterly. With the central temple destroyed and the leadership discredited or divided, the cohesion that made Tula a capital simply dissolved. The later Aztec histories, which looked back on the Toltecs as a golden age, preserved the memory of this collapse. They spoke of internal strife, of disputes among the gods themselves, and of the people of Tula scattering to the winds. The great city was not conquered by an outside army, but abandoned by its own people, who left the scorched temple and the silent stone warriors to guard an empty plaza. The story of Tula is a powerful lesson in how environmental stress can become political stress. A drought does not just kill crops, it can dissolve the shared beliefs and loyalties that hold a complex society together, turning allies into rivals and a capital into a cautionary tale written in ash and stone. The collapse of Tula was a story of internal fracture under a drying sky. Far to the south, on a continent of ancient kingdoms, a different kind of transition unfolded, one where a climate shift did not destroy a civilization, but prompted its careful, strategic relocation. The story begins at a sandstone hill rising from the flat plains where the Limpopo and rivers meet, in what is now northern South Africa. Here, around the year 1070, the first major kingdom in southern Africa took shape. It was a society of sophisticated goldsmiths and international traders, its elite living atop the sacred hill, separated from the commoners below, a clear sign of a complex stratified social order. Their wealth flowed from a lush environment, a perfect confluence of fertile river valleys and reliable summer rains that supported large herds of cattle and productive fields of sorghum and millet. This agricultural bounty funded long-distance trade networks that sent ivory and gold to ports on the Swahili coast, connecting southern Africa to the Indian Ocean world. For over 2 centuries, thrived as a regional power, its leaders buried in royal graves accompanied by exquisite gold artifacts. Then, the rains began to change. Around 1300, a significant climatic shift occurred across southern Africa. Monsoon rain belts and the intertropical convergence zone, the great engine of seasonal rainfall, began to drift southward. For this meant the once reliable summer rains became less predictable. The region grew drier. The rivers that were the lifeblood of the kingdom carried less water. The grasslands that fed the royal herds began to thin. This was not a sudden catastrophe, but a slow, generational transformation of the landscape. The environmental foundation of power was gradually eroding. The elite on their hill faced a dilemma. They could cling to a location of deep spiritual and ancestral significance, but with diminishing resources. Or they could make a calculated move to secure their future. The evidence suggests they chose the latter. The drier conditions made the Zimbabwe Plateau to the north a more attractive prospect. This higher plateau, with its cooler temperatures and more reliable rainfall patterns under the new climate regime, offered a fresh start with untapped pastures and agricultural potential. So, in a deliberate transfer of power and knowledge, the elite have organized a migration. They did not abandon their culture, they packed it up. They took their expertise in statecraft, their advanced knowledge of stone architecture, their gold-working techniques, and their sacred symbols of authority. They moved their political center to a new, more environmentally favorable location, the site that would become Great Zimbabwe. This was not an invasion or a conquest, but a logical, state-led adaptation to a changing world. Itself was not violently destroyed, it was gradually depopulated as the focus of power shifted northward. Its hill was left as a silent ancestor, a place of origin. The rise of Great Zimbabwe, then, is directly linked to the climatic pressures on its predecessor. The magnificent stone walls and conical towers of the new capital were not built in a vacuum. They were the next chapter in a story of resilience. The kingdom did not fall. It simply walked to where the rain still fell reliably, demonstrating that sometimes the most profound act of leadership is not to fight a changing environment, but to follow the ecological logic to a new home, carrying a legacy forward into a more sustainable future. The story of a kingdom moving to follow the rain reveals a profound adaptability. On the vast Mongolian steppe, a different kind of experiment met a more definitive end. A powerful nomadic empire made a startling decision in the 8th century. They built a permanent, walled capital. The city of the royal court rose from the grasslands as a monumental declaration of a new era. For nomadic peoples whose power was mobile, anchored to herds and seasonal pastures, this was a revolutionary act. Its existence was made possible by a rare and temporary gift from the climate. For several decades, the steppe experienced an unusually wet period. Rainfall increased, and the grasslands bloomed with a vitality that supported something extraordinary, the cultivation of crops. This window of abundance allowed the two experiment with a hybrid model, maintaining their pastoral traditions while supplementing their diet with millet and other grains grown in the fertile soil around their new city. Became a center of crafts, religion, and administration, its walls enclosing a grand palace, temples, and bustling workshops. It was a bold vision of a settled steppe empire. Then, the window closed. In the mid-9th century, the climatic pendulum swung back. The unusual wetness gave way to a return of the steppe's normal, drier regime, and perhaps even a period of intensified desiccation. The rains that had coaxed grain from the ground became unreliable, then failed. The experimental fields around withered. For a society that had partially invested its food security in farming, this was a direct and devastating blow. The loss of the agricultural supplement placed immense strain on their primary food source, the herds of sheep, goats, and horses that grazed the surrounding pastures. Those pastures, now drying out, could support fewer animals. The very foundation of their hybrid economy crumbled. Scarcity bred vulnerability. The environmental crisis created internal weakness and social stress at the worst possible moment. In the year 840, external forces capitalized on this fragility. A rival nomadic group, the Kyrgyz, swept down from the north. Historians note that the attack coincided perfectly with the period of distress. A steppe confederation at the height of its power, well-fed and mobile, would have been a formidable opponent, likely able to maneuver or withstand such a challenge. But a confederation weakened by famine, its people perhaps divided over the failed experiment of their static capital, was critically vulnerable. The combination proved fatal. The Kyrgyz assault breached the walls of, sacking the city that symbolized the settled ambitions. The state collapsed with startling speed. In the aftermath, the people did not vanish, but they fragmented and migrated, their political unity shattered. They abandoned the grand, stationary capital entirely, a concept that the drier steppe could no longer support. Was left as a skeleton of stone and mud brick on the open plain, a stark lesson in the risks of building a permanent future on a temporary climate. Its ruins remind us that the most ambitious societal transformations are often negotiated with the environment, and when the terms of that negotiation change, even the strongest walls cannot hold back the consequences. The fate of the capital was sealed by a climate that its favor. 1,000 years earlier and a continent away, another riverine kingdom discovered that the same life-giving waters could become an instrument of political death. On the fertile banks of the Nile, south of Egypt's traditional borders, the kingdom of Kush rose to power with its capital at. This was no simple outpost, but a sophisticated urban center of massive mud-brick temples, circular dwellings, and formidable fortifications, the heart of the first great Nubian state. Its wealth was built on the same ancient rhythm that nourished Egypt, the annual inundation of the Nile. Each summer, the river would swell with rains from the Ethiopian highlands, spreading a layer of rich, renewing silt across the floodplain. The farmers have timed their entire agricultural cycle to this predictable event, planting their crops in the damp, fertile soil left behind as the waters receded. This was a covenant with the river, a guarantee of abundance that allowed the kingdom to grow powerful, trading gold, ivory, and ebony with its northern neighbor, and at times challenging it for supremacy. But a covenant requires both parties to keep their word. In the late 17th century before Common Era, the Nile broke its promise. Paleoclimatic data, drawn from sediment cores in the Nile Delta and from records of river levels kept by the Egyptians themselves, reveals a prolonged period of abnormally low floods. For years, perhaps decades, the Great Inundation failed to reach its necessary height. The life-giving waters did not spread across the fields, but remained confined within the river's main channel. The result was a slow-motion agricultural disaster. The silt, the natural fertilizer that renewed the land, was not deposited. The soil, deprived of its annual soaking, grew parched and less productive. Harvests dwindled season after season. For the people of this was more than a few lean years, it was an unraveling of their world's fundamental logic. The stored grain in the royal granaries, meant to buffer against a single poor flood, was slowly exhausted. Famine began to spread through the kingdom. A state's primary duty is to ensure the well-being of its people, and when it cannot provide bread, its authority crumbles. The social order, maintained by a ruling class whose legitimacy was tied to prosperity and divine favor, would have been under immense strain. Hunger breeds desperation, and desperation erodes loyalty. The military, needed to defend the kingdom's borders and trade routes, would have been difficult to sustain with a malnourished population and a faltering economy. The kingdom was being hollowed out from within by an invisible, relentless pressure. This period of profound internal weakness created a historic opportunity for a newly resurgent power to the north. Egypt had just expelled the Hyksos rulers and inaugurated its vigorous, expansionist New Kingdom period. Pharaohs like the first and his successors looked south, seeing a traditional rival in a state of distress. The environmental crisis that had crippled agriculture and cohesion made what would have been a difficult military campaign into a feasible conquest. The Egyptian armies advanced into Nubia and the weakened kingdom of Kush, its resilience drained by years of scarcity, could not muster an effective defense. Itself was sacked around 1550 before Common Era. The Egyptians did not merely conquer the territory, they absorbed it, establishing their own administrative centers and building temples to impose their culture and gods. The fall is a stark lesson in geopolitical dominoes, where an environmental trigger knocks over the first in a line of consequences. The low Nile floods did not raise the Egyptian army's swords, but they ensured that when those swords were raised, the kingdom they struck was already on its knees. It reminds us that the stability of a civilization is often a delicate balance, and sometimes the force that tips the scale is not an invading army, but a river that simply does not rise. The Great Arch of still stands, a single, soaring rib of brickwork casting a long shadow over the flat Mesopotamian plain. This was the throne room of the empire, the winter capital where the King of Kings, held court in unparalleled splendor. The city was a marvel of Persian engineering and luxury, its vast administrative complex a hub for the empire that rivaled Rome. Its lifeblood was the Tigris River, which provided water for its lush gardens, transport for its goods, and a moat for its defense. Yet this intimate relationship with the river held a destructive secret. It was built on low, flat ground directly adjacent to the Tigris floodplain, a location chosen for access and prestige, but one that placed it directly in the path of the river's occasional fury. Historical records from the era speak not just of the city's wealth, but of its repeated, traumatic encounters with the water. The Tigris, fed by snowmelt from distant mountains, was prone to sudden, massive floods, especially during periods of unusually heavy spring rains. When these floods came, they did not gently lap at the city's edges, they inundated it. The low-lying palace districts and residential quarters would be submerged, their mud brick walls dissolving, their treasured contents ruined. Each catastrophic flood was a massive economic and logistical blow, requiring years of costly reconstruction and re-stabilization. But the floods did more than immediate damage. They each left behind a silent, accumulating gift, a thick layer of silt. This silt was the fertile soil of the upstream highlands, carried hundreds of miles by the river. Over centuries, this repeated silt deposition began to subtly reshape the very landscape around. The riverbed itself, clogged with sediment, could become shallower and more prone to shifting its course. The floodplain around the city gradually rose, potentially altering drainage patterns and making some areas perpetually waterlogged or less suitable for building. This was a slow, geological pressure compounding the sudden, violent shocks of the floods. Compounding this natural process was a human one. Upstream deforestation, whether for agriculture, fuel, or construction across the wider region, would have accelerated soil erosion. More bare soil meant more silt washing into the Tigris with every rain, adding to the sediment load that eventually settled around the capital. The site became a victim of its own geography and the wider environmental changes across the watershed. By the time of the Arab conquest in the 7th century, while still symbolically potent, was a capital carrying the heavy weight of its own vulnerability. The conquering forces saw a magnificent but flawed prize. The new Muslim rulers, establishing the Abbasid Caliphate, made a calculated decision that spoke volumes. They did not choose to rebuild and fortify the ancient capital with its history of flooding. Instead, they founded a brand new capital just upriver, Baghdad. Baghdad was strategically placed on a more stable, elevated site between the Tigris and Euphrates, a location chosen explicitly for its better defensibility and, critically, its reduced flood risk. The founding of Baghdad was the final, logical verdict on its environmental predicament. The Grand Arch was left as a stunning monument to a bygone empire, while the seat of power moved to a place where the river could be a servant, not a periodic master. The silence that fell over the throne room under that arch is not just the silence of political change, but the silence of a location that had been judged, over centuries of hardship, as fundamentally impractical. It is a reminder that even the most glorious capitals must answer to the relentless, physical logic of the land they are built upon, and when that logic becomes a sentence of repeated disaster, power will eventually find a new home. The Arch stands as a monument to a river's unpredictable power. On the other side of Asia, another empire placed a similar, monumental bet on water, but in a landscape of even greater thirst. The plains of central Myanmar are a rain shadow, a dry zone where the monsoon clouds lose their burden before they arrive. Yet here, between the 9th and 13th centuries, the kings of Pagan built a capital of staggering ambition, a city of 10,000 temples whose spires rose like a stone forest from the arid plain. This was not an act of folly, but of profound hydrological confidence. The survival of Pagan, the heart of the First Burmese Empire, depended on a single ingenious equation, capturing the distant abundance of the Irrawaddy River and forcing it to feed the desert. They engineered an immense network of reservoirs, called tanks and canals, a system designed to trap seasonal runoff and river water, storing it for the long, dry months. This artificial watershed transformed the plain into a green island of rice paddies, supporting the population of artisans, monks, and soldiers who built the glorious temples of Ananda and, for centuries, the system worked, turning water into stone and faith into empire. But the very success of this civilization contained the seeds of its vulnerability. The irrigation network was a masterpiece, but it was also a machine that required constant, clean fuel, a steady flow of water free of obstruction. Two silent processes began to compromise that flow. The first was silt. Upstream from Pagan in the forested hills, land was being cleared for agriculture and settlements as the kingdom expanded. Without the roots of trees to hold the soil in place, the seasonal rains washed enormous quantities of silt into the Irrawaddy and its tributaries. This sediment traveled downstream, entering the intake channels of Pagan's irrigation system. Over generations, the canals and reservoirs began to fill with this slow, creeping tide of mud. What were once deep channels capable of moving large volumes of water became shallow, choked passages. The holding capacity of the tanks diminished. Maintaining the system required a level of dredging and coordinated labor that became exponentially more difficult as the problem grew worse. The second pressure may have come from the Earth itself. The region is seismically active, and some researchers suggest that tectonic uplift, a gradual rising of the land, could have altered the gradient of the river very slightly over time. Even a small change in the river's elevation relative to the canal intakes could have made it harder to divert water into the system, or could have caused the river to shift its course marginally away from the city's lifelines. These were not dramatic events, but slow geological shifts measured in centuries, imperceptible to any single ruler but catastrophic over the of a capital. The result was a gradual agricultural decline. The fields that fed the empire began to receive less water or water delivered. Crop yields would have dropped, and the surplus that funded temple construction and supported the urban elite began to shrink. The state's power was directly tied to its ability to command this surplus, and as it dwindled, so did the central authority's strength and legitimacy. This slow-burning environmental crisis created a critical weakness at precisely the wrong moment. In the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire under Khan sent military expeditions into the region. The pagan kingdom faced these incursions not from a position of fortified abundance, but from a position of growing internal strain. The agricultural system was under stress, the logistical and economic foundation of the state was eroding, and the kingdom's ability to rally a sustained defense was compromised. The Mongol incursions were not the sole cause of collapse, but they were the hammer that struck a structure already weakened by dry rot. After these events, the political elite gradually abandoned Pagan as an administrative capital, shifting their center of power to areas with more reliable water access. The city of 10,000 temples was never truly deserted. It remained and remains a living religious site, but its role as the beating political heart of an empire ceased. Its silent, sun-baked plain tells a story of brilliant adaptation to a dry land, and of the invisible, accumulating costs that such an adaptation can incur. The temples still call pilgrims to prayer, but the intricate network of channels that made their construction possible lies buried, a hidden testament to a kingdom that mastered water, until the land and the river quietly reclaimed their due. Khan's summer capital was a city of legend, a place of marble palaces and hunting parks so splendid it inspired's dream of Xanadu. Yet its true story is etched not in poetry, but in the hard soil of the Mongolian steppe. This was a capital built on an ecological frontier, a deliberate display of power in a landscape that offered only a narrow window of hospitality. The Yuan dynasty established in a region where the fertile grasslands of the south gradually give way to the drier, more fragile pastures of the north. Its existence relied on a precise and delicate balance, the ability to support the immense seasonal influx of the imperial court, its soldiers, artisans, and all their animals, for several months each year. This was a massive logistical undertaking, drawing on grain transported from distant lands, and crucially, the local grasses that fed the thousands of horses essential to the Mongol elite. The city's splendor was a seasonal performance, one entirely dependent on the generosity of the land. That generosity began to wane as the global climate entered a cooler phase. The onset of the Little Ice Age, a period of climatic cooling that began in the 14th century, brought increased aridity to the steppe. The rains grew less reliable, and the growing seasons shortened. The grasslands around, already living on the margin, began to thin and lose their vitality. Sustaining the large herds required by the court became a struggle. The very resource that had made the site a viable summer retreat, its pasture land, was diminishing. This environmental pressure coincided with the dynasty's political decline. As the central Yuan government in modern Beijing faced growing instability and rebellion in the mid-14th century, the resources and will to maintain the distant summer capital faded. The journey became less a ritual of power and more a hazardous trek through a landscape offering less bounty. When the dynasty finally fell in 1368, the practical reasons to maintain vanished entirely. The Ming armies captured and lightly damaged the city, but its true abandonment was a slower, more organic process. Without the imperial court to drive its economy and maintenance, there was no reason for a large population to remain in such a challenging environment. The marble halls so vividly described by travelers like Marco Polo were not violently destroyed. They were simply left to the elements. The steppe winds whistled through empty pavilions, and the hardy grasses slowly reclaimed the great plazas. Its desertion is a poignant chapter in the story of climate and power. It shows that even the most magnificent imperial projects are negotiations with the local environment. Khan could command the construction of a paradise, but he could not command the rains that sustained it. The city became a ghost not because its walls were breached in war, but because the climatic conditions that allowed its dream to exist gradually, leaving behind a beautiful and empty stage where the only performance was the relentless, patient work of time. From the steppe to the desert, the jungle to the coast, a single, haunting pattern emerges from these 30 empty thrones. The specific crisis varied, but the script of collapse followed a distressingly familiar sequence. Prolonged drought stands as the most common executioner, parching the fields of the Maya, the Hittites, and the people of Angkor. Deforestation and the soil erosion that followed crippled Aksum and choked the Portive with silt. In places like the canals, salinization slowly poisoned the land from within. Rivers, those life-giving arteries, betrayed capitals through course changes, as with the Indus Valley cities, or through catastrophic flooding, as at Cahokia. And occasionally, the earth itself revolted, with seismic events shattering Petra's water system and volcanic fury drowning the Mohenjo world in ash and wave. Yet these environmental blows were not random acts of nature striking healthy societies. In case after case, we see a civilization first laying the groundwork for its own vulnerability. Success itself became the trap. To feed growing populations, to fund monumental projects that projected divine or imperial power, to sustain the very complexity that defined them, these societies pushed their local environments to the limit and often beyond. They cleared forests for fuel, for construction, and for farmland, not realizing they were stripping away their watershed's protection. They intensified agriculture, unaware they were depleting soils or accumulating salts. They built dense urban centers entirely dependent on engineered water systems, creating magnificent but fragile dependencies. They optimized for a specific stable climate, a golden age they assumed would last forever. When the climate inevitably shifted, or when the accumulated environmental debt finally came due, these societies had no buffer, no resilience left. The drought, the flood, or the silted harbor was rarely the sole cause of collapse. Instead, it was the critical trigger, the overwhelming shock that exposed every hidden frailty. It revealed the fragility of a social contract based on elite promises of abundance that could no longer be kept. It strained the logistics of a centralized state that could no longer feed its people or maintain its infrastructure. It ignited simmering political and factional tensions over dwindling resources. The environmental crisis did not create these weaknesses, it ruthlessly exploited them, turning a challenge into a cascade of failure. This recurring narrative offers us a profound warning written across. It tells us that a civilization's greatest achievements and its most critical vulnerabilities are often two sides of the same coin. The stone temple and the deforested hill, the Grand Canal and the salted field, the wealthy port and the eroding highland, they are linked by an invisible thread of cause and consequence. The abandonment of these capitals was not a mystery of lost knowledge or malevolent gods. It was the logical, often predictable outcome of a broken partnership with the natural world. Their silent stones ask us a pressing question, not about their past, but about our own present. In our pursuit of growth and grandeur, what dependencies are we creating, and what buffers are we eroding? For the day when our own climate inevitably shifts, these silent cities leave us with a profound and unsettling truth. The story of human civilization is not separate from the story of the Earth. It is a single, intertwined narrative. For too long, we have viewed history through a lens of kings and battles, of political intrigue and cultural triumph, while treating the environment as mere backdrop, a passive stage for the human drama. The ruins of these 30 capitals force us to rewrite that script. They testify that environmental factors are not just scenery, they are central characters, often the decisive ones, in the epic of rise and fall. Each empty plaza is a monument to a broken partnership, a place where the dialogue between a society and its home ground faltered and then fell silent. This legacy in the stones is a dual one, celebrating breathtaking human ingenuity while simultaneously marking the point where that ingenuity, pushed beyond sustainable limits, became its own undoing. We see not just vulnerability to forces beyond control, but the consequences of choices that, over generations, eroded the very foundation of survival. This is the powerful, long-term perspective these sites offer, a view across centuries that reveals the ultimate interdependence of any civilization and its environment. Today, we face our own version of this ancient challenge, though on a planetary scale. Our climate is shifting, not in isolated river valleys, but across continents. Our demand for resources draws down not local aquifers, but global ones. The patterns are hauntingly familiar: a push for growth testing ecological limits, a complex society built on intricate systems that assume stability. The lessons from these fallen capitals are not tales of doom, but urgent case studies in resilience. They ask us to look at our own world and identify the quiet, accumulating pressures, the dependencies we take for granted, the buffers we are eroding. They remind us that the most brilliant technology cannot replace a depleted water table or regrow a lost forest overnight. The call from these ruins is not to abandon progress, but to redefine it with a longer memory. It is to build our future with the humility to learn from those who came before, to recognize that true strength lies not in dominating the natural world, but in forging a lasting balance with it. The next chapter of our story is still being written, and we hold the pen.